Medieval meat myths: feast like kings or starve like serfs. Imagine a world where meat was the ultimate luxury, reserved only for kings and nobles, while peasants scraped by on stale bread and watery soup. Sounds familiar, right? That's the story most of us grew up hearing about the Middle Ages. But what if I told you that this common image is only half the truth? That medieval people actually ate meat more often and more diversely than you might expect, and that their relationship with meat was far more complex than simple rich feast versus poor scraps? Let's dive into the real story behind meat in medieval times, a tale of social status, seasons, religious rules, and survival strategies that shaped what people ate across Europe for centuries. First off, the idea that everyone in the Middle Ages was starving and lived on a diet of hard bread and watery gruel is a myth. Yes, famine and poverty were real problems, but many people, including peasants, had access to some meat, not daily, but regularly enough to make it an important part of their diet. Meanwhile, nobles and clergy enjoyed grand feasts with elaborate meat dishes that seemed almost divine in their abundance and variety. So why the misconception? Partly, it comes from modern assumptions and Hollywood's gloomy depictions of the era. Partly, it's because meat wasn't equally available or affordable to all. The reality was nuanced. Meat was a precious resource, carefully rationed and deeply intertwined with social hierarchy and religious practice. Medieval society was rigidly divided into estates, nobility, clergy, and peasants. Each group had very different access to meat. Nobles owned vast hunting grounds and herds of livestock. Clergy followed strict dietary rules that varied by season. Peasants raised animals, hunted small game, and relied on preserved meats and offal to stretch their resources. Even the time of year influenced what was on the table. Hunting seasons, religious fasting days, and food preservation methods meant meat availability fluctuated throughout the year. What looked like scarcity was often a matter of timing and tradition. In this series, we'll unravel these layers, bust myths about medieval diets, and uncover how people from all walks of life experienced meat, from the peasants' humble stews to the nobles' grand banquets. By the end, you'll see that medieval meat culture wasn't just about survival or privilege. It was a rich, evolving story that still echoes in our kitchens today. Ready to challenge what you thought you knew? Let's start peeling back the layers of medieval meat mysteries, because their food habits might surprise you more than you expect. Starving serfs or meat lovers? Debunking medieval food myths. When you hear Middle Ages, what pops into your mind? Grim peasants gnawing on dry bread, nobles gorging on endless meat platters, and everyone else stuck somewhere painfully in between? That image is everywhere, but it's mostly a myth. The truth about medieval diets, especially meat consumption, is far more interesting and surprising. Let's cut to the chase. Not all medieval people were starving, and not all nobles were feasting like kings every day. In fact, the reality was a patchwork of social status, regional resources, and religious customs that shaped who ate what, when, and how often. The biggest misconception is that peasants never ate meat. Yes, meat was expensive and often reserved for special occasions, but peasants did have access to it. Chickens, pigs, sheep, and cattle were raised on farms, and although eating fresh meat daily was impossible for most, preserved meat and small game were part of their diet. Offal, organ meats, and less desirable cuts were common and highly valued, often prepared in stews or pies to stretch every bit of nutrition. Meanwhile, the nobility had access to large quantities of meat, but even they weren't constantly feasting. Banquets with piles of roasted boar, venison, and fowl were spectacular occasions, but day-to-day meals were simpler and still carefully planned. Hunting rights were jealously guarded, and the forest was a critical source of wild game, deer, rabbits, wild birds, for the upper classes. Religion also played a huge role in shaping medieval eating habits. The church mandated strict fasting days, sometimes more than half the year, when eating meat was forbidden. Fish, eggs, and dairy often replaced meat on these days, forcing people to adapt and diversify their diets. And then there's the question of spoilage and food safety. The idea that medieval people ate rotten meat regularly is misleading. Preservation techniques like salting, smoking, and drying were well developed and essential. People knew their food; they wouldn't risk illness on spoiled meat. When meat was bad, it was thrown out or cooked into highly salted dishes to mask any off flavors. In fact, the scarcity of fresh meat outside the wealthy classes led to a rich culture of recipes using preserved meat, offal, and fish, making medieval cuisine surprisingly varied and resourceful. From peasants' pottages to noble pâtés, meat played many roles beyond just luxury. So next time you picture medieval meals, don't think in extremes. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, a complex, fascinating story of who got to eat, what, when, and how. In the next block, we'll explore exactly where that meat came from, the farms, forests, and waterways that fed a whole continent for centuries. Where did medieval meat come from? Farms, forests, and feast tables. Ever wondered where medieval people actually got their meat? Spoiler, it wasn't just from giant castle kitchens overflowing with roasted beasts. The sources of meat in the Middle Ages were as varied as the people who ate it, and understanding these origins helps unlock the mystery of who really enjoyed meat, and how often. Most meat started right at home. For peasants and villagers, the backyard farm was the primary source. Chickens clucked for eggs and meat, pigs roamed to feast on kitchen scraps and acorns, sheep provided both wool and lamb, while cows gave milk, and when the time came, beef. But animals weren't raised just for eating; they were economic assets, tools of survival. This meant meat wasn't wasted on a whim. A pig was usually slaughtered once a year, often in late autumn, providing fresh meat and a supply of preserved pork for months to come. Then there was the forest, a treasure trove for the nobility and sometimes the lucky peasants. Hunting was not only sport, but a critical source of wild meat. Deer, boar, rabbits, and game birds filled the larder. Hunting rights were tightly controlled by law and tradition, reserved mostly for lords and kings, who proudly served venison and wildfowl at their grand feasts. For common folk, hunting small game or fishing in local rivers was more accessible, but still limited by rules and resources. Speaking of fishing, rivers, lakes, and seas provided vital protein, especially on fasting days when meat was off limits. Freshwater fish like carp and pike and saltwater fish like cod and herring were essential to medieval diets. Fish could also be salted or dried for long storage, expanding availability through winter and lean seasons. Markets and fairs were another meat source, especially for townspeople. But prices fluctuated, and fresh meat wasn't always affordable or fresh. Instead, preserved meats, salted, smoked, or dried, were traded widely and helped bridge gaps in supply. Interestingly, medieval people wasted very little. Every part of an animal found a use, from muscle meat to offal, bones, and fat. These were turned into soups, sausages, broths, and even glue. The idea of throwing away inedible scraps was foreign. Resourcefulness was a survival skill. In short, medieval meat came from a complex web of farms, forests, rivers, and markets, with access shaped by class, law, and season. This rich network ensured that meat wasn't a simple commodity for a few, but a vital, if sometimes rare, part of many diets. Next up, we'll zoom in on the peasants themselves, how they raised, hunted, and ate meat in a world where every bite counted. Peasant plates. Did the poor really eat meat? When we think of medieval peasants, the image of a meager diet, mostly bread, porridge, and vegetables, comes to mind. But did the poor really never taste meat? The answer is more complicated and, frankly, a bit surprising. Peasants did eat meat, though not always in the juicy, hearty portions we might imagine at a noble's table. For most peasants, raising animals was less about feasting and more about survival and economy. Chickens were the smallest, most common livestock, easy to keep and quick to raise, providing both eggs and occasional meat. Pigs were the backbone of peasant meat supply. Thanks to their ability to forage in forests and eat scraps, they required little extra food. When pigs were slaughtered, usually once a year, their meat was carefully preserved through salting or smoking to last through winter. Cattle and sheep were more valuable for milk, wool, or work, so slaughtering them was a serious decision, often reserved for special occasions or hard times. This means fresh beef or lamb on a peasant's table was rare and cherished. But meat wasn't only about farm animals. Small game like rabbits, hares, and birds could be hunted or trapped, especially in more rural areas. While hunting laws often restricted peasants from hunting large game, these smaller animals were a vital protein source when available. What about offal? Peasants were masters of using every part of the animal. Liver, kidneys, tongues, and even feet were not wasted. These lesser cuts were often cooked into hearty stews or sausages, making a nourishing meal from what the wealthy might discard. Fish was also crucial, especially during religious fasting days when meat was forbidden. Rivers, ponds, and coastal areas offered fish that could supplement or replace meat in the diet. Salted and dried fish extended availability when fresh wasn't an option. Cooking methods for peasants were simple but effective. Stews, pottages, and porridges allowed for stretching limited meat across many meals. Spices were rare, but herbs and local flavorings added variety. So, no, peasants didn't feast like nobles, but neither were they doomed to a meatless existence. Their diets were pragmatic, seasonally adjusted, and shaped by the rhythms of farm life and local resources. In the next block, we'll explore how the clergy, often seen as ascetic and strict, navigated meat consumption with their complex web of fasting rules and religious customs. Spoiler, their meat habits were surprisingly flexible. Holy meat. How medieval clergy balanced fasting and feasting. When you think of medieval clergy, what comes to mind? Stern monks in austere cells, surviving on bread and water, right? While fasting and abstinence were serious parts of their lives, the reality of medieval clergy's relationship with meat is far more nuanced, and sometimes downright surprising. The Church set strict rules on meat consumption. During fasts, sometimes covering more than half the year, eating meat from warm-blooded animals was forbidden. Fish, eggs, dairy, and vegetables took center stage on fasting days. But this didn't mean monks and priests starved or only ate bland meals. Far from it. The medieval religious calendar was a complex tapestry of feasts, fasts, and holy days, and meat consumption had to dance around these. For example, fish was not considered meat and was freely eaten on fasting days. This led to an entire fish economy and a wide variety of fish dishes in monasteries and churches. Salted, smoked, and dried fish were staples that could be stored and eaten year-round, allowing religious communities to maintain a rich and diverse diet. Moreover, fasting rules often applied differently depending on status, location, and the interpretation of local clergy. Some orders were stricter, others more lenient. Nobles and bishops sometimes had dispensations allowing them to eat meat when others could not, highlighting the intertwining of religion and social privilege. Monasteries were also centers of agriculture and animal husbandry. Many owned herds of animals and kept fish ponds specifically to supply meat and fish in line with church rules. Their kitchens were surprisingly sophisticated, experimenting with recipes that fit fasting restrictions yet offered flavorful and nourishing meals. Interestingly, some monks produced mock meats, dishes made from nuts, legumes, or fish that mimic the texture or taste of meat. These culinary innovations show how important meat's flavor and symbolism were, even when it was forbidden. In essence, medieval clergy lived in a world where meat was both a spiritual challenge and a culinary delight. They navigated complex rules, seasonal changes, and social hierarchies to balance discipline with the human desire for satisfying food. Next, we'll move from monasteries to castles and halls, diving into the extravagant meat feasts of the medieval nobility, where every bite was a statement of power and prestige. Noble feasts, how the medieval elite ate meat like gods. Imagine a banquet hall filled with the clatter of silverware, roaring firelight flickering off golden platters piled high with roasted boar, venison, and swan. The smell of spices, the sound of minstrels. A medieval noble feast was nothing short of a spectacle. But was meat really this abundant for the elite every day? And what did these feasts say about power and status? Medieval nobility didn't just eat meat, they celebrated it. For lords and ladies, meat was a symbol of wealth, privilege, and control over land and resources. Their kitchens were staffed by skilled cooks who prepared elaborate dishes, often combining multiple types of meat with spices imported from faraway lands. Hunting was a noble pastime and a source of fresh game for these feasts. Deer, boar, hares, pheasants, and even exotic birds like peacocks might grace the table. Hunting rights were strictly enforced by law. Only nobles could hunt large game on their lands, which reinforced social hierarchies. When the hunt was successful, the banquet was an event to showcase that success. But don't picture endless meat every single day. Even nobles ate meat mostly on special occasions, holidays, weddings, victories, or religious festivals. On ordinary days, their diet was more modest, but still richer than common folks. Game and livestock were valuable, and wasting meat was frowned upon. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and saffron were prized not just for flavor, but as status symbols. The more exotic and plentiful the spices, the higher the prestige of the host. Meat was often served with rich sauces and sweet-sour glazes, blending tastes unfamiliar to modern palates, but beloved then. Feasts also served a political purpose, inviting guests, showing generosity, and reinforcing alliances. A grand meat-heavy banquet was a way for nobles to flex their power and impress rivals and vassals alike. Yet behind the glamour was a reality. Meat had to be carefully preserved and managed to last through seasons, as livestock was a critical economic resource. Nobles relied heavily on skilled cooks, butchers, and hunters to maintain the flow of meat. In the next block, we'll leave the castles and turn to the soldiers and knights, discovering what meat meant on the battlefield and in the tough life of medieval warriors. Warriors' fare. What did medieval soldiers eat on the march? Imagine the life of a medieval soldier. Long marches, cold nights, battles fought with sword and shield. It's a brutal, exhausting existence. But what fueled these warriors? Was meat a staple on the battlefield, or just a distant luxury? The truth is that soldiers' diets were a far cry from the noble feasts back home. Fresh meat was often scarce during campaigns. Instead, medieval armies relied heavily on preserved meat, salted, smoked, or dried, which could survive long journeys without refrigeration. Salted pork and beef were among the most common rations. These tough, salty slabs were eaten alongside hard bread, cheese, and dried peas. Sometimes armies would carry pouches of dried sausage or blood pudding to provide needed protein and energy. These preserved meats were heavy and salty, but crucial for survival. When conditions allowed, soldiers supplemented their diet with whatever fresh meat or game they could hunt or seize from the local countryside. Wild rabbits, birds, or fish were welcome treats after weeks on preserved rations. But fresh meat was a luxury and could never be guaranteed. Camp kitchens, when they existed, were primitive. Often soldiers cooked over open fires with limited utensils. Stews and porridges were common, easy to prepare and filling. Spices and fancy sauces were unheard of. The goal was simple sustenance. Interestingly, knights and noble warriors on campaign might have slightly better provisions, sometimes with cooks accompanying them. Yet even they faced hardships, and the legendary lavish feasts were rare exceptions during war. Preserving meat for military use was a serious business. Salt and smoke not only kept meat edible, but also prevented disease outbreaks in camps, where hygiene was poor and food spoilage could cause disaster. In a way, the soldier's diet reflected the harsh realities of medieval warfare, rugged, resourceful, and focused on endurance rather than luxury. Next, we'll explore how the changing seasons shaped medieval meat consumption, why spring and winter tables looked very different, and how people adapted to the rhythms of nature. Seasons of meat, how medieval tables changed throughout the year. Picture a medieval village across the seasons, lush green fields in spring, golden harvests in autumn, biting cold winters blanketed in snow. These rhythms didn't just shape lives, they dictated what appeared on the dinner table, especially when it came to meat. In spring, fresh meat was scarce. After a long winter, many animals had been slaughtered during autumn and preserved to last through cold months. This meant early spring meals often relied on salted or smoked meat stored from the previous year. Livestock gave birth in spring, so farmers usually avoided killing young animals to rebuild herds. Fresh meat was a rare treat, replaced by fresh vegetables, dairy, and fish, especially during Lent and other fasting periods. Summer brought the first fresh meat of the year. As animals grazed on abundant pastures, livestock fattened, making summer and early autumn prime times for slaughter. This was the season when peasants might kill a pig or a sheep, enjoying fresh meat before the long preservation cycle began again. Autumn was the most important season for meat preparation. This was butchering season, a critical time when farmers slaughtered animals they couldn't keep through winter. The fresh meat was either consumed quickly or preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. Large communal events often coincided with slaughtering, sometimes accompanied by feasts and celebrations. Winter was the time when preserved meats ruled. Fresh produce was limited, so salted hams, smoked sausages, and dried beef became staples. Wealthier households also kept fish in salt or smoked form to supplement the diet. Since fresh meat was rarely available, skillful cooks made hearty stews and pottages with preserved meats to keep everyone nourished during harsh months. Religious fasting also intersected with seasonal rhythms, intensifying meat restrictions during key periods such as Lent and Advent. This layered complexity onto what might otherwise be a simple seasonal cycle. These cycles created a food system that was sustainable and adapted to nature's constraints. The medieval diet was far from monotonous. It was a living dance with the seasons, combining fresh, preserved, and substituted foods in a continuous balancing act. Next, we'll dive into the role of festivals and feasts, how meat became not just sustenance, but celebration, community, and ritual. Feasts and festivals. When meat became a celebration. Imagine the excitement in a medieval village or castle as a festival approached, a time when daily hardships faded and the community gathered to eat, drink, and celebrate. At the heart of these events? Meat. But not just as food, it was a symbol of joy, status, and sacred tradition. Medieval festivals, from Christmas to harvest celebrations, were prime occasions for serving meat. For peasants, these feasts were rare chances to taste fresh or roasted meat, something often out of reach in everyday life. For nobles and clergy, festivals meant lavish spreads of multiple meat dishes, showcasing wealth and piety. Christmas, Easter, and All Saints' Day were especially meat-heavy celebrations. Nobles would organize grand banquets featuring boar, venison, swan, and capons, while peasants might share in communal roasts or stews. The preparation and sharing of meat reinforced social bonds and hierarchical roles. Hosts displayed generosity, guests enjoyed honor. But meat wasn't just about indulgence. It had ritual significance. For example, the medieval boar's head ceremony at Christmas symbolized the triumph of good over evil. Certain meats were linked to saints, legends, and seasonal cycles, weaving food deeply into cultural meaning. Markets and fairs timed with festivals also boosted access to fresh meat. Traveling butchers and merchants brought preserved and fresh meats, making these times of the year moments when meat was more widely available and affordable. Religious fasting rules often relaxed around major festivals, allowing meat consumption after long periods of abstinence. This made the contrast between fasting and feasting even more pronounced, heightening the sense of celebration. In short, meat during festivals was more than nutrition. It was a powerful social and spiritual statement. It brought communities together, marked the calendar, and punctuated the rhythms of medieval life with joy and abundance. Next, we'll peel back the curtain on medieval food preservation, the ancient techniques that made meat last through the lean times and kept kitchens stocked year-round. Medieval meat preservation, how they made meat last. Imagine living in a world without refrigerators or freezers. How would you keep precious meat from spoiling in a time when every scrap mattered? Medieval people faced this challenge every day, and their solutions were ingenious, practical, and surprisingly effective. Preserving meat was not just a convenience, it was a necessity. Without preservation, the fresh meat from autumn slaughter would rot quickly, leaving people hungry in winter. That's why medieval cooks and farmers mastered several preservation techniques that kept meat edible for months. Salting was the king of preservation methods. Salt drew moisture out of meat, creating an environment hostile to bacteria. Large cuts of pork or beef were heavily salted and packed tightly in barrels or wooden boxes. Salted meat was tough and salty, but could be rehydrated in soups and stews, making it a staple for many households. Smoking was another popular method. Meat was hung over low, smoldering fires, infusing it with smoky flavors and drying it out gradually. Smoking not only extended shelf life, but added a rich, distinctive taste. Smoked hams and sausages were prized delicacies that could last through winter and beyond. Drying or air-curing meat was common in colder, drier regions. Thin strips of meat or sausages were hung in well-ventilated places, allowing natural air to desiccate them. This method required patience but resulted in long-lasting, portable protein ideal for travel or storage. Pickling meat in vinegar or brine was less common but still practiced, especially in some monastic communities. Acidic environments inhibited bacterial growth and preserved meat with a tangy twist. Every part of the animal found a preservation technique, from whole hams and shoulders to sausages, blood puddings, and offal. Sausages and cured meats often mixed scraps with spices, herbs, and grains to stretch precious resources further. Preserved meat was vital for soldiers on campaigns, fishermen on long voyages, and peasants through harsh winters. It was also a trade commodity, with salted hams and smoked sausages traveling far from their origins. Far from eating spoiled food, medieval people developed sophisticated, reliable methods to keep meat safe and tasty. These traditions laid the groundwork for modern curing and smoking techniques still cherished today. Next, we'll tackle one of the biggest myths about medieval meat. Was it really rotten and disgusting, or did people have standards and tastes much like ours? Rotten meat myth busted. Did medieval people really eat spoiled food? You've probably heard it before. Medieval people ate rotten, maggot-infested meat because they had no refrigeration and poor hygiene. Sounds disgusting, right? But here's the twist. This popular myth doesn't hold up when we dig into the facts. Medieval people actually had pretty sophisticated ways to judge meat freshness and quality. Smell, color, texture, and even taste were trusted indicators. Spoiled meat was generally avoided because it made people sick, just like today. Far from being clueless about food safety, they had learned through experience how to spot bad meat and how to preserve it. The reliance on salting, smoking, and drying wasn't just about preservation, but also about preventing spoilage before it started. These methods made meat safe to eat long after fresh meat would have gone bad. Plus, preserved meats were often soaked, boiled, or cooked in stews, which further reduced risks. What about the idea that peasants ate only scraps and offal? While offal was commonly consumed, it was not a sign of desperation, but of resourcefulness and respect for the animal. Many offal parts, liver, heart, kidneys, are nutritious and flavorful, and medieval cooks created delicious dishes from them. Also, food markets and butchers in towns maintained standards to keep customers coming back. Spoiled meat could ruin reputations and business, so sellers took care to provide good quality. Religious fasting and feast days encouraged people to be mindful of their food, and monasteries often maintained strict rules about food preparation and cleanliness. Hygiene, while not modern, was better than many assume. Of course, foodborne illness existed as it does today, but medieval people were not reckless. They adapted to their environment with practical knowledge, and the image of widespread meat rot is more myth than reality. Up next, how does medieval meat culture compare to ours? We'll connect past and present food habits and uncover surprising continuities and differences. From medieval tables to modern plates, what changed and what didn't? Think medieval eating habits were light years away from what we know today. You might be surprised. While technology, culture, and taste have evolved, many threads link medieval meat consumption to our modern plates. Back then, meat was a prized resource tightly bound to social status, seasonality, and religious rules. Today, meat is often abundant, mass-produced, and consumed daily in many parts of the world. But the echoes of the past remain. For starters, the importance of preservation techniques hasn't disappeared. Modern curing, smoking, and drying methods have their roots in medieval practices. Our favorite hams, sausages, and smoked meats owe a lot to those early innovations designed to beat spoilage and seasonality. Seasonality still matters for many who follow traditional or sustainable eating. Farmers' markets and local butchers echo the medieval rhythm of fresh meat availability in spring and summer, with preserved goods carrying people through winter. The social symbolism of meat hasn't vanished either. High-end restaurants and festive dinners still use special cuts and exotic game to signal luxury, much like noble feasts did centuries ago. Conversely, meat's affordability and accessibility today mean it's no longer a strict status marker for most, but it remains a cultural centerpiece. Religious fasting around meat persists in many traditions, whether Lent in Christianity, halal and kosher laws, or other dietary customs. These rules create patterns of abstinence and indulgence still relevant to millions. Yet modern supply chains, refrigeration, and industrial farming have profoundly changed how meat reaches our tables. The medieval challenges of preservation and scarcity gave way to convenience and excess, raising new questions about sustainability, ethics, and health. Looking back, medieval people were neither starved nor ignorant. They lived complex, adaptive food lives that balanced necessity, culture, and pleasure. Their relationship with meat teaches us valuable lessons about respect for resources, seasonality, and community. In our final block, we'll sum up the real story about medieval meat, cutting through myths and celebrating the fascinating reality that shaped lives and appetites centuries ago. The Real Meat Story. Medieval myths debunked and lessons for today. When you hear medieval meat, what comes to mind? Rotten scraps, constant hunger, and grubby peasants fighting over leftovers? It's time to drop those cliches. The real story of meat in the Middle Ages is far richer, more complex, and frankly, a lot more interesting. Medieval people did eat meat, not every day, but regularly enough to shape their diets, cultures, and economies. Nobles feasted like kings. Soldiers survived on preserved rations. Clergy balanced fasting with fish and mock meats, and peasants enjoyed meat seasonally and when they could afford it. The idea that meat was universally rare or revolting is simply false. Meat was a marker of status, faith, and seasonal rhythm. It symbolized power in castles, sustenance in villages, and devotion in monasteries. Preservation methods like salting and smoking were advanced, ensuring meat lasted and stayed safe. Far from eating spoiled flesh, medieval people had sharp senses and traditions to protect themselves from illness. What does this mean for us today? It's a reminder that food is deeply tied to culture, environment, and technology. Our modern abundance might make us forget how precious and seasonal meat once was. Reflecting on medieval food ways can inspire respect for seasonality, sustainability, and the rich traditions behind our meals. So next time you sit down to a steak, a sausage, or a smoked ham, remember, you're tasting history. The Middle Ages weren't just dark times of deprivation. They were vibrant eras of culinary ingenuity and social complexity, where meat was truly fit for gods, even if most people got the leftovers. Thanks for joining this journey through medieval meat. Stay curious, stay hungry, and don't forget, sometimes history tastes better than the myths.